What happened when my abusive coach found out my dad is a street boxer? Coach Brennan grabbed my shoulder during water break and squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. He leaned close so only I could hear and said, if I missed another layup during practice, he'd make me run suicides until I puked. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and his grip felt like iron clamps digging into muscle. I was 15 years old, 5'9", and weighed maybe 130 soaking wet. He was 6'3", 240 pounds of former college athlete who'd washed out of coaching at better schools and ended up at Lincoln High where nobody asked too many questions about his methods. The gymnasium echoed with squeaking shoes and bouncing basketballs. My teammates ran drills while Brennan held me in place, his fingers pressing into the exact spot he'd grabbed yesterday and the day before that. The bruises formed layers now, purple and yellow and green. A timeline of his discipline mapped across my shoulders and arms. I kept my face blank because showing pain only made him squeeze harder. He released me finally and shoved me back toward the court. I stumbled, but caught myself before falling. Nobody looked at me directly, but I could feel them watching from the corners of their eyes. I'd been on varsity basketball since freshman year because I was fast and could shoot threes with decent accuracy. Brennan had been coaching at Lincoln for 12 years and had a reputation for winning games and producing players who went to college on scholarships. What people didn't talk about openly was how he treated the kids who weren't his favorites, the ones who didn't come from families with money or connections. I was one of those kids. My mom worked double shifts as a nurse, and my dad did construction and odd jobs, whatever kept bills paid and food on the table. We lived in the apartments on the east side where rent was cheap, and nobody complained about noise. Practice lasted 2 more hours, and Brennan found reasons to single me out 11 times. I counted because counting gave me something to focus on besides the fear in my stomach. He made me run extra drills while everyone else rested. He criticized my form on every shot, even when the ball went through the net clean. He assigned me to guard our best player during scrimmage, and then screamed at me when I couldn't stop him from scoring. The other guys on the team stayed quiet and kept their heads down. They'd learned the same lesson I was learning now. Speaking up meant becoming the new target. After practice ended, I changed clothes in the locker room while my shoulders throbbed with deep, aching pain. DeAndre Wilson sat on the bench next to me tying his shoes. He was a junior, our starting point guard, and one of Brennan's favorites because his dad owned 3 car dealerships and donated money to the athletic department. He glanced at my shoulder where the bruise was visible above my t-shirt collar and said quietly that Brennan had been worse this season than ever before. His voice dropped so low, I had to lean in to hear him say that 2 players had quit already and one kid's parents were talking about filing a complaint. I asked why nobody had reported him yet. DeAndre finished tying his shoes and stood up. He said his dad told him that Brennan had connections with the school board and the athletic director. Complaints disappeared, and families who pushed too hard found their kids benched or kicked off teams. The system protected coaches who won championships regardless of how they treated players. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone in the locker room with damp concrete walls that smelled like sweat and mildew, and years of teenage boys trying to become men under pressure they didn't know how to handle. I walked home through streets where streetlights flickered and cast uneven shadows across cracked sidewalks. My backpack felt heavier than usual, loaded with textbooks I'd need for homework I was too tired to complete. The apartment building rose 6 stories with exterior hallways and iron railings. Our unit was on the 4th floor at the end of the corridor. I could hear my little sister Tessa laughing before I opened the door. She was 8 years old and watching cartoons on the couch while Mom made dinner in the kitchen. Mom looked up when I came in and immediately noticed something was wrong. She had that ability mothers develop to read their children's pain even when they're trying to hide it. She asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine, just tired from practice. She studied my face for another moment before returning to chopping vegetables. I dropped my backpack by the door and headed to the bathroom to examine my shoulders in the mirror. The bruises were worse than I'd thought, deep purple marks that wrapped around the joint where Brennan's fingers had dug in repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. Dad came home an hour later while we were eating dinner. He worked construction for a company that did commercial renovations and came home every night covered in dust and dried sweat. He kissed Mom and ruffled Tessa's hair before sitting down at the table. His hands were scarred from years of manual labor, and his knuckles looked swollen from some injury he hadn't mentioned. He asked about my day, and I gave him the standard response that school was fine, and practice was fine, and everything was fine. He watched me with dark eyes that missed nothing, but he didn't push for more information. After dinner, I tried to do homework but couldn't concentrate. The pain in my shoulders had spread down my arms and up my neck. I took 2 ibuprofen and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, I could hear Tessa playing in her room and Mom washing dishes in the kitchen. Dad was watching something on television, volume turned low. This was our routine, the quiet evenings that bookended days filled with work and school, and the constant grind of trying to stay afloat in a city that didn't care whether we made it or drowned. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore. Getting dressed required careful movements to avoid aggravating the bruises. I wore a hoodie despite the warm weather to hide the marks from Mom and Tessa. At school, I moved through classes in a fog, unable to focus on lectures or assignments. My best friend Luis noticed during lunch and asked what was wrong. I told him Brennan was getting worse and showed him the bruises in the bathroom where nobody else could see. Luis's face went pale, and he said I needed to report it before Brennan seriously injured me. I explained what DeAndre had told me about complaints disappearing and families getting retaliated against. Luis argued that didn't matter, that what Brennan was doing was assault and somebody had to stop him. I asked if he was volunteering to file the report and watch his family get targeted. He didn't have an answer for that. We finished lunch in silence and went to our afternoon classes. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like physical pressure. I was trapped between enduring abuse and risking consequences that could affect my whole family. Practice that afternoon started with conditioning drills. Brennan made us run full court sprints for 30 minutes straight. Every time someone slowed down, he added 5 more sprints to the total count. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, but I kept running. Stopping would only make things worse. After conditioning came defensive drills where Brennan paired us up and had us play one-on-one at full intensity. He paired me against Jamal Thompson, our center who had 4 inches and 60 pounds on me. Jamal was a good guy who didn't want to hurt anybody, but Brennan stood on the sideline screaming at him to be more aggressive and physical. Jamal shoved me hard on a drive to the basket and I went down on the hardwood floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me and pain exploded through my already injured shoulder. Brennan blew his whistle and told me to get up and stop being soft. I pushed myself up slowly, testing whether anything was seriously damaged. Everything hurt, but nothing felt broken. Brennan ordered us to run it again. The drill continued for another 20 minutes. Jamal knocked me down 3 more times because Brennan kept demanding more physicality. By the end, my shoulder was screaming, and I could taste blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my cheek during one of the falls. Brennan finally called for water break, and I stumbled to the bench. My vision swam, and I felt like I might actually throw up. DeAndre handed me a water bottle without saying anything. The sympathy in his eyes made me feel worse somehow, like I was an animal caught in a trap that everyone could see, but nobody would help free. Brennan approached me at the bench and told me my defensive stance was pathetic, and my effort level was embarrassing the whole team. He said if I couldn't handle physical basketball, maybe I should quit and make room for someone who actually wanted to play. His voice carried across the gym loud enough for everyone to hear. The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. I kept my eyes on the floor and didn't respond. Responding only escalated things. I'd learned that lesson the hard way during my first week on the team. After practice, I limped to the locker room and changed clothes mechanically. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the sinks and barely recognized myself. The kid staring back looked beaten down and exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Brennan was breaking something inside me piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. I grabbed my backpack and left through the side exit to avoid seeing anyone else from the team. The walk home took longer than usual because my left knee had started swelling during the last drill. I favored it without thinking and developed a slight limp. People on the street glanced at me and looked away quickly, not wanting to get involved in whatever trouble they assumed I'd found. At the apartment building, I climbed the stairs slowly, using the railing for support. Inside our unit, Mom was helping Tessa with homework at the kitchen table. She looked up, and her expression shifted immediately from focused to alarmed. She asked what happened to me. I tried to brush it off as a rough practice, but she wasn't buying it. She stood up and walked over, examining me with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years in emergency rooms treating injuries. She pulled up my sleeve before I could stop her and saw the layered bruises on my shoulder. Her face went very still and very calm in the way that meant she was actually furious, but controlling it for my sake. She asked in a quiet voice if my coach did this to me. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to lie and protect everyone from the complications that would follow if the truth came out, but another part was so tired of carrying this alone. I nodded once and watched my mother's expression transform into something I'd never seen before. She told Tessa to go to her room and do her reading. Tessa protested, but Mom's tone left no room for argument. Once Tessa was gone, Mom turned back to me and asked how long this had been happening. I told her the truth. 2 weeks of escalating physical abuse disguised as coaching. The bruises, the excessive drills, the public humiliation, the culture of fear that kept everyone silent. Mom listened without interrupting, her jaw getting tighter with every detail. When I finished, she said we were calling the police and filing a report immediately. I panicked and explained what DeAndre had said about complaints disappearing and families facing retaliation. Mom's expression didn't change. She said she didn't care about retaliation, that what Brennan was doing was criminal assault and she wouldn't let it continue. We were still arguing when Dad came home. He walked into the kitchen and immediately sensed the tension. Mom explained the situation in clipped, angry sentences, while I stood there feeling like I was 6 years old again and had disappointed them both somehow. Dad's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Shock, anger, and finally a cold, calculating look that made me nervous. He asked to see the bruises. I showed him everything. His hands were gentle as he examined my shoulders, but I could feel the rage radiating off him in waves. Dad asked me Coach Brennan's full name and whether he drove a red pickup truck with a custom grill. I confirmed both details and asked how he knew. Dad said he'd seen Brennan around the neighborhood a few times, had noticed the Lincoln High coaching jacket and the swagger that came with minor local fame. He asked if Brennan worked out at the public gym on Foster Avenue. Again, I confirmed. Dad nodded slowly and told Mom he'd handle this situation his way. Mom started to object, but Dad cut her off with a look. He said some things couldn't be fixed by calling police or filing official complaints. Some things required a different kind of justice. I asked what he meant. Dad sat down at the table and was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something I'd never known about his past. Before I was born, before he'd gotten his construction job and settled into normal working life, Dad had fought in underground boxing matches for money. Not the legal amateur bouts in gyms with referees and rules, but the street fights held in warehouses and parking lots where men beat each other bloody for cash and reputation. He'd been good at it, good enough to make a living for several years before my mom convinced him to quit, after he took too much damage in a fight that should have been stopped earlier. He said he'd walked away from that world when they found out Mom was pregnant with me. He'd promised her he was done with violence and fighting for money. He'd kept that promise for 16 years, but hearing about a grown man putting his hands on his son in ways that left bruises and fear changed the calculation. Some promises had exceptions built into them for situations exactly like this. He stood up from the table and told Mom he'd be back in a few hours. She grabbed his arm and asked him not to do anything that would land him in jail. Dad kissed her forehead and said he'd be careful, but Brennan needed to understand there were consequences for touching his kid. Dad left through the front door without another word. Mom and I stood in the kitchen listening to his footsteps fade down the exterior hallway. Mom looked at me and said, Dad better not get arrested because she couldn't handle his bail and rent in the same month. I almost laughed at the practical concern cutting through the tension, but my shoulder hurt too much. Mom made me sit down and brought out her nursing supplies. She cleaned the worst abrasions and applied ice packs to reduce the swelling. Her touch was clinical and efficient, but I could see her blinking back tears. The next 2 hours passed in strange, suspended time. Mom made dinner mechanically while Tessa asked questions about why everyone seemed upset. Mom gave vague, reassuring answers that satisfied an 8-year-old, but wouldn't have fooled anyone older. I sat on the couch pretending to do homework while actually replaying Dad's words in my head. Underground boxing, fighting for money, a whole life I'd known nothing about. It recontextualized things I'd noticed over the years. The way Dad moved with precise control, the scars on his knuckles, the time he'd stepped between Mom and an aggressive drunk on the street and made the guy back down without throwing a punch. Dad came home just after 8 o'clock. His knuckles were split and bleeding and his shirt had blood spatter across the front. Mom rushed to him and checked for injuries, but he waved her off, saying the blood wasn't his. He went to the bathroom and washed his hands thoroughly, using soap and hot water until the skin turned pink. When he came back to the kitchen, his face was calm and settled. He looked at me and said, Coach Brennan wouldn't be a problem anymore. I asked what he'd done. Dad said he'd had a conversation with Brennan at the gym parking lot and explained some basic facts about boundaries and consequences. Mom demanded details. Dad sighed and explained he'd waited for Brennan to finish his workout and approached him at his truck. Brennan had recognized Dad from seeing him around and made some dismissive comment about parents who couldn't control their kids. Dad had responded by breaking Brennan's nose with a single punch. When Brennan went down, Dad told him, if he ever touched me again or retaliated in any way, the next encounter would involve broken ribs and hospital stays. Brennan had apparently understood the message despite the blood pouring from his face. Mom was furious. She yelled that Dad could be arrested for assault, that this would only make things worse, that violence never solved anything. Dad listened to her vent, and then said quietly that sometimes violence was the only language bullies understood. Official complaints would have gone nowhere, and Brennan would have continued hurting kids. Now Brennan knew there was someone willing to meet his violence with greater violence. That would stop him more effectively than any report to the school board. Mom argued for another 10 minutes, but her heart wasn't in it. She knew Dad was probably right, even if she hated admitting it. I went to school the next morning carrying equal parts dread and anticipation. Word would have spread by now about Brennan getting jumped in the parking lot. Everyone would have theories about who did it and why. I walked through the front entrance expecting to be called to the principal's office immediately, but nothing happened. First period came and went normally. During second period, Luis found me and asked if I'd heard that Coach Brennan had called in sick. I said I hadn't heard and tried to keep my face neutral. Luis said the rumor was Brennan got into a fight at the gym and got his ass kicked by someone half his size. The story spread through school like wildfire. By lunch, everyone had a different version. Some said Brennan had started a fight with a professional boxer and gotten destroyed. Others claimed he'd picked on the wrong guy and ended up with a broken nose and fractured ego. Nobody connected it to me. Why would they? I was just a skinny sophomore who got pushed around at practice. The idea that I had connections to someone who could hurt Brennan didn't fit the narrative people had already constructed about who I was. Practice that afternoon was weird. Brennan showed up with a bandaged nose and 2 black eyes that made him look like he'd fought a raccoon and lost. His whole demeanor was different. He ran normal drills without excessive punishment. He corrected mistakes with actual coaching instead of screaming and humiliation. When he spoke to me, his tone was professional and neutral. No edge of cruelty underneath. Several guys on the team noticed and exchanged confused glances, but nobody questioned the change openly. After practice, DeAndre pulled me aside and asked if I knew what happened to Brennan. I said I'd heard the same rumors as everyone else. DeAndre studied my face for a moment and said it was weird that Brennan's sudden attitude adjustment coincided with me getting brutalized less. I shrugged and said maybe Brennan had finally realized he was being a dick. DeAndre didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. We changed and left separately. I walked home feeling lighter than I had in weeks, despite the lingering soreness in my shoulder. That evening, Dad and I talked while Mom was at work and Tessa was asleep. He explained that handling Brennan with violence was a temporary solution, but I needed to understand the broader problem. Coaches like Brennan existed in every sport and every school. They abused their authority because systems protected them and families were afraid to fight back. Breaking Brennan's nose stopped him from hurting me, but didn't address the structural issues that let him abuse kids for 12 years without consequences. Dad said, if I wanted real change, I needed to document everything and build a case that couldn't be ignored or buried. I asked how I was supposed to do that when complaints disappeared and families faced retaliation. Dad said I needed to be smarter than the system. Keep detailed records of every incident with dates and witnesses. Take photos of injuries. Record conversations if possible. Build evidence that was so overwhelming the school board couldn't dismiss it without obvious corruption. Then present it to people with actual power, not just local administrators who had incentives to protect their coaches. Dad mentioned a lawyer he knew who did pro bono work for families who couldn't afford representation. She'd helped workers file complaints against employers who violated safety regulations. She might be willing to help if the evidence was solid. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed Dad's advice. I kept a journal documenting every practice, including what drills we ran and how Brennan treated different players. I took photos of bruises and injuries using the camera on my cheap phone. I talked to teammates and got them to share their own experiences with Brennan. Most were reluctant at first, but seeing someone finally pushing back gave them courage. Jamal told me about stress fractures in his foot that Brennan forced him to play through. Luis mentioned a friend who'd quit the team last year after Brennan grabbed him by the throat during practice. The pattern that emerged was damning. Brennan systematically targeted players from poor families or single-parent households, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and didn't have time to attend games or ask questions about practice, kids who wouldn't be missed if they quit. Meanwhile, he treated players like DeAndre with favoritism and protection, knowing their families had resources and connections to cause problems if pushed too far. It was calculated abuse based on economic discrimination, and Brennan had been getting away with it for over a decade. I gave all the documentation to Dad, who passed it to his lawyer friend Veronica Okafor. She reviewed everything and called a meeting at her office. Mom came with me. Veronica laid out our options in clear terms. We could file a civil lawsuit against Brennan and the school district for creating an environment that allowed abuse. We could report to state athletic associations and educational oversight boards. We could take the story to local media and force public attention. Each approach had risks and benefits, but all required us to go public and withstand the backlash that would follow. Mom asked if this would affect my ability to play basketball. Veronica said probably yes, at least at Lincoln High. Brennan would likely be suspended during investigation, but the administration would resent us for creating problems. Other coaches might blacklist me from their programs. College scouts might see me as someone who caused drama. The price of justice was often isolation and lost opportunities. That was the calculation families had to make when deciding whether to fight powerful institutions or accept abuse as the cost of participation. I said I wanted to move forward regardless of consequences. Playing basketball under Brennan wasn't worth the physical and psychological damage. If speaking up meant losing opportunities in the short term, that was better than letting Brennan continue hurting kids who came after me. Mom squeezed my hand and told Veronica to file whatever paperwork was necessary. Veronica nodded and said she'd start with a formal complaint to the school board and state athletic association. She'd give them one chance to take meaningful action before escalating to lawsuits and media coverage. The complaint was filed on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, the whole school knew something was happening. Principal Vasquez called me to his office during second period. He sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable and asked if I understood the seriousness of accusing a coach of abuse without proof. I told him I had extensive documentation including photos, written testimony from multiple players, and detailed records spanning several weeks. His expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. He said the school board would investigate thoroughly and asked me not to discuss the situation with other students or media while the investigation was ongoing. I agreed to stay quiet publicly, but word spread anyway. Some students were supportive and shared their own stories about Brennan's behavior. Others accused me of being a snitch who couldn't handle tough coaching. The basketball team fractured along predictable lines. Players like DeAndre, whose families had resources, expressed support privately, but stayed neutral publicly. Players who'd been Brennan's victims thanked me for speaking up. Players who'd benefited from Brennan's favoritism acted like I'd betrayed them personally. Jamal stopped talking to me completely, even though I knew Brennan had injured him too. Brennan was placed on administrative leave 2 days after the complaint was filed. Assistant coach Ramirez took over the team temporarily. Practice became calmer and more focused on actual basketball skill development rather than punishment and humiliation. The change was so dramatic that several guys who'd been planning to quit decided to stay, but the atmosphere remained tense. Everyone knew a reckoning was coming and nobody knew how it would shake out. The investigation dragged on for 3 weeks, while school board members interviewed players, reviewed documentation, and debated their response. During that time, I received anonymous threatening messages through social media. People told me I'd ruined Brennan's career over nothing, that I was soft and couldn't handle real coaching, that I'd better watch my back. One message included a photo of our apartment building, with a caption about how easy it would be to find me. I showed everything to Veronica, who documented it and added it to our complaint. She said this proved the toxic culture that protected abusers. Instead of addressing the abuse, people attacked victims for speaking up. That was exactly why institutional change was so difficult and so necessary. Dad wanted to track down whoever sent the threatening messages and have another parking lot conversation. Mom talked him out of it by pointing out that would only give our opponents ammunition to paint us as the aggressors. We had to stay above reproach while the investigation proceeded. Any violence or retaliation would be used to discredit the complaint and protect Brennan. It was frustrating but true. Victims had to play by stricter rules than abusers, because the system looked for any excuse to dismiss complaints as personal vendettas rather than legitimate grievances about misconduct. The school board finally released their findings on a Thursday afternoon. They determined that Coach Brennan had engaged in inappropriate physical contact and created a hostile environment for certain players. He was officially terminated and banned from coaching at any school in the district. The board also implemented new policies requiring coaches to complete training on appropriate discipline methods and establishing a confidential reporting system for athletes experiencing abuse. It was a partial victory. Brennan was gone, but the new policies felt like cosmetic changes rather than structural reform. Veronica said we could push for more by filing civil lawsuits against both Brennan personally and the school district for negligence. The financial cost of litigation would force institutions to take abuse prevention more seriously. But she also warned that lawsuits were expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. We had to decide if pursuing maximum accountability was worth the additional stress on our family. Mom and Dad discussed it for several days. Eventually, they decided to accept the school board's resolution and move forward rather than spending years in court fighting for money we didn't really need. I returned to basketball practice under Coach Ramirez, feeling strange and untethered. The thing I'd been fighting against was gone, but the damage remained. My relationship with teammates was fractured. My body still carried injuries that would take months to fully heal. My trust in authority figures was shattered. Winning felt hollow because I'd lost so much in the process. Ramirez tried to rebuild team unity, but some divides were too deep. By the end of the season, several players had transferred to other schools or quit basketball entirely. The program that Brennan had built through fear and intimidation collapsed once the foundation of abuse was removed. College scouts who'd been interested in players from Lincoln stopped coming to games. Our record suffered without Brennan's brutal conditioning regime, even though practices were healthier. The message was clear. Winning through abuse was rewarded while losing with dignity was punished. That was the incentive structure that created coaches like Brennan in the first place. Excellence at any cost was valued over athlete well-being. Speaking up about abuse meant sacrificing competitive advantages. The system was designed to perpetuate itself regardless of who got hurt. I finished sophomore year with mixed feelings about everything that happened. On one hand, I'd stopped an abuser and potentially protected future players from similar treatment. On the other hand, I'd learned that justice was complicated, incomplete, and often unsatisfying. Brennan was fired, but would likely get hired somewhere else that didn't check references carefully. The school board implemented policies, but enforcement would be inconsistent. Players who'd supported me faced social consequences, while players who'd stayed silent moved on without repercussions. There was no clean resolution where good triumphed completely over evil. During summer break, Dad took me to the gym where he used to train for street fights. It was a dingy basement space with heavy bags and a worn canvas ring. The guys who trained there were mostly older men with scarred knuckles and cauliflower ears. Dad introduced me to Angelo, the man who'd taught him to fight 20 years ago. Angelo looked me over and asked if I wanted to learn the craft properly. Not for street fighting, but for understanding how to defend myself and channel anger into something productive. I said yes. Training with Angelo was brutally hard, but fair. He pushed me physically but never punished or humiliated me. He taught proper technique for punching, defensive movement, conditioning that built strength without causing injury. The work was honest in ways basketball under Brennan never had been. When Angelo corrected mistakes, it was about improving performance, not exerting dominance. When I struggled, he offered encouragement, not mockery. The gym became a place where I could process trauma through physical exertion, while learning skills that made me feel less vulnerable. Word got around that I was training, and several guys from the basketball team asked if they could join. I brought Luis first, then Jamal, who'd finally admitted that Brennan had crossed lines with him too. Soon, we had a regular group of 5 players meeting at Angelo's gym 3 times a week. We ran drills and sparred and built a different kind of team unity based on mutual respect rather than fear. Angelo watched us with approval and told Dad we were good kids who'd been failed by adults who should have protected us. That was the real crime. Not that bullies existed, but that institutions enabled them. Junior year started with cautious optimism. Coach Ramirez had spent the summer recruiting players who'd left and rebuilding the program's culture. The new team was smaller but healthier. Practices focused on skill development and strategy rather than punishment. We lost more games than Brennan's teams had won, but nobody missed the abuse. Scouts gradually returned once they realized Lincoln still had talent despite the coaching change. Life moved forward, even though scars remained. Brennan resurfaced at a private school 40 miles away that apparently didn't care about his termination. Veronica found out through her network and considered filing complaints with their administration, but ultimately decided we'd done what we could. You couldn't save every kid from every abuser. All you could do was fight your own battles and hope the example inspired others to do the same. I hated that Brennan was coaching again, but recognized the limits of our power. At least his new victims would have our documentation as precedent if they needed to file complaints of their own. Dad's intervention in the parking lot was technically assault, and Brennan could have pressed charges. He never did. Veronica suspected Brennan knew that criminal proceedings would expose his abuse to public scrutiny and destroy his career completely. Taking a broken nose and staying quiet was the better option for him. That grim calculation was probably the only reason Dad avoided jail time. The threat of mutual destruction kept both sides from escalating further. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was the closest approximation available within our constraints. I graduated high school with decent grades and a basketball scholarship to a state university 2 hours away. Not a major program, but a legitimate opportunity to play college ball and get an education without crushing student debt. The scholarship was partial, covering tuition but not housing or meals. Mom and Dad would still need to work extra shifts to support me, but it was manageable. I accepted the offer knowing I'd earned it through actual skill rather than surviving abuse. That distinction mattered more than prestige or money. The summer before college, I returned to Angelo's gym and helped train younger kids who were starting boxing. Some had experienced abuse from coaches or teachers or family members. Others just wanted to learn how to defend themselves in a world that felt dangerous and chaotic. I taught them what Angelo had taught me about technique, conditioning, and channeling anger into productive motion. I also taught them about documentation and reporting systems and how to identify when authority figures crossed lines. Physical skills were important, but knowledge was power. My last conversation with Dad before leaving for college happened on the apartment balcony overlooking the city. He asked if I regretted speaking up about Brennan despite everything it cost. I thought about it honestly before answering. The short-term consequences were harsh. Fractured friendships, lost opportunities, ongoing threats from people who valued winning over ethics. But the alternative was suffering in silence while Brennan destroyed more kids. I told Dad I'd make the same choice again, even knowing how it turned out. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of whether you won completely. Dad nodded and said he was proud of me for having courage he'd never had at my age. Then he reminded me that the world was full of bullies in different forms, and I'd faced them my whole life. Learning to fight back, whether through documentation or legal action or occasionally parking lot confrontations, was essential survival skill in a system designed to protect power rather than people. College brought new challenges and new coaches with different methods. Some were excellent, some were mediocre. None were abusive like Brennan. I played 4 years of basketball, earned a degree in sports management, and worked with university administration to improve athlete advocacy programs. The experience with Brennan shaped my career path in ways I hadn't anticipated. Fighting institutional abuse became not just personal survival, but professional calling. Last I heard, Brennan got fired from the private school after another family filed complaints similar to ours. He's working at a sporting goods store now, no longer coaching. That's not perfect justice, but it's something. Sometimes small victories are all you get. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.